Captain Lyravex stood in the ruined control center of the once busy space station Emberfall, surrounded by fire, smoke, and silence. The place was a graveyard. Not long ago, Emberfall had been a peaceful hub where alien species came together for trade, politics, and culture. Now its walls were cracked, wires hung like vines from the ceiling, and lifeless bodies floated slowly in the zero-gravity corridors. Her boots crunched on shattered glass as she walked through the mess, her silver skin glowing faintly under the red warning lights still flickering across the broken panels. The station had sent out a distress call, but by the time her ship, Ziraka's Mercy, arrived, nothing was left but destruction. Something had attacked. Something brutal, fast, and merciless. Lyravex didn't yet know what or why, but she could feel the danger still lurking. That was when she heard footsteps behind her, light, steady, and unhurried. She turned sharply, hand on her plasma sidearm, and saw a human man stepping out from the shadows. He wore a worn-out flight suit, his dark hair messy, and his boots covered in dust. There was a name patch on his chest, Mason. He didn't look afraid. In fact, he looked oddly calm for someone who should be hiding. "I'd offer you a drink," he said, his voice dry and relaxed. "But the bar's kind of trashed." He held up a silver flask and gave her a small, tired smile. Lyra didn't smile back. Her eyes narrowed as she took a step forward. "Did you do this?" she asked coldly. Mason shook his head. "Nope. But I'm probably the reason it happened." Lyra tensed, ready to draw her weapon, but he made no move to fight. Instead, he uncapped the flask and took a long sip. The sharp smell of something strong filled the air. It wasn't alien. It was human. "That's ethanol," Lyra said, blinking in surprise. "It's whiskey," Mason said. "A Terran drink. Want to try?" She hesitated. The situation was strange, and the man was even stranger. But curiosity won for a moment. She took the flask and tasted it. The liquid burned her mouth like liquid fire. Her eyes went wide as she coughed, then coughed harder, her whole throat on fire. "Is this poison?" she gasped, handing the flask back in shock. Mason laughed quietly. "It's called freedom in a bottle," he said. Then the floor shook with a heavy rumble. Somewhere deep inside the station, a loud explosion echoed through the metal halls. Lights flickered even harder, and the station groaned like a wounded beast. Mason's smile disappeared. "They're back," he said, voice tense now. "The Scorch Swarm." Lyra's blood froze. She had heard of the swarm. Everyone had. A race of cruel, unstoppable machines and monsters that left nothing alive. "They're just myths," she said, but even she didn't believe her own words. Mason didn't answer. Instead, he looked out of a shattered viewport at the black, void beyond. A massive shape moved through space. A huge ship, dark and smooth, glowing with eerie orange veins. It looked like a giant shark swimming through the stars. "They came for me," Mason said softly, "and they're not done yet." Then the station lights flared again, and a new alarm sounded, one she had never heard before. Not a fire warning, not a hull breach. This was worse. A boarding drone had arrived, a hunter from the swarm. Without warning, the corridor behind them hissed as a metal door blew open. A huge creature stepped through, 8 feet tall, part machine and part bone, with red glowing eyes and claws that shimmered with energy. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its mission was clear. Kill everything. Lyra raised her weapon. Mason raised his. The war had found them both, and there was no going back. The floor beneath Lyravex shook as the boarding drone's heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. She had only a moment to react. The creature, towering and terrifying, raised its glowing claws, its eyes fixed on them with unblinking malice. Lyra's instincts kicked in, and she immediately drew her plasma pistol, aiming for the creature's chest. But before she could fire, Mason yanked her to the side. The drone fired its first round, and Lyra barely avoided the blast as she stumbled behind a nearby piece of cover. The force of the explosion rattled her bones, and the station walls groaned under the pressure. Her heart raced, but her training kicked in, and she steadied herself. Mason wasn't waiting for her to recover. He was already on the move. "Come on!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Without hesitation, Lyra followed him, her plasma gun in hand, even though she didn't know if it would do any good against such a beast. The drone wasn't just a machine, it was a living nightmare. They ran through the maze of hallways, sharp corners blurring past them as debris fell around them. The noise of the creature's pursuit grew louder, more oppressive with every step. Lyra's mind raced. This wasn't just a random attack. The swarm had chosen this moment, and they had chosen it for a reason. Mason was the key. But she didn't have time to think about that now. They had to escape. They turned a corner and skidded into a maintenance bay. Mason sprinted toward an old, battered human fighter ship sitting in the corner. It looked like it hadn't flown in years, rusted, scratched, and barely held together by duct tape and wire. "Is this a joke?" Lyra asked breathlessly, staring at the ship. Mason threw open the hatch without looking at her. "Not if we want to survive," he replied simply, already climbing in. The hum of the engines came to life as he powered up the ship with a few quick presses of buttons. The hangar bay doors began to rumble open, and the first shot of plasma from the drone struck the metal floor just inches from Lyra's feet. "Get in," Mason ordered again, his voice tight with urgency. Lyra didn't hesitate this time. She jumped into the cockpit and slammed the hatch shut behind her, the whole ship shaking from the blast. They were already moving. The fighter shot forward, flying out of the bay into the void of space, where the swarm's ships hovered, dark and intimidating in the distance. The drone followed them, relentless and powerful. Lyra glanced back through the viewport, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature was gaining on them, its glowing eyes flickering with malice. Its massive claws reached out, as if it could grasp them even in the emptiness of space. Mason gritted his teeth. "Hold on!" he yelled. He yanked the fighter into a sharp dive, the sudden movement throwing them both forward in their seats. The drone fired again, narrowly missing them. The ship's hull rattled from the energy surge, but Mason didn't slow down. He pushed the fighter to its limits, weaving through the debris and wreckage of the space station like a skilled pilot. Though this ship was anything but fast or agile, Lyra could feel the desperation in his movements. They were running out of time. The swarm's drone wasn't going to stop. Neither would the larger fleet. Mason made a hard turn, racing toward the nearby nebula. The swirling gases and energy storms of the nebula were their only chance. The swarm ships would struggle to track them in the storm's interference. Lyra could see the storm ahead, the violent clouds of radiation and unstable energy flashing across the stars. It was dangerous, but it was also their only hope. The drone was still following, and it was getting closer. Lyra knew they couldn't outrun it. They had to fight. She checked her plasma gun, half-charged. It wouldn't do much against a swarm war machine, but she had to try. Just as she prepared to fire, Mason's voice cut through the cockpit. "Get ready," he said, his eyes flashing with determination. "This is where we make our stand." And then they plunged into the nebula with the drone right behind them and the rest of the galaxy waiting. The nebula's turbulent gases and crackling energy fields enveloped the small fighter ship as Mason guided it deeper into the storm. The sky outside was a swirling mess of violet and neon blue, flashing with violent bursts of radiation and arcs of charged particles. The air inside the cockpit grew thick with tension, the noise from the ship's failing systems blending with the constant hum of the failing engine. Lyra Vex gripped the sides of her seat, bracing herself as the ship rocked violently with each sudden turn. The drone was still on them, relentless in its pursuit, its glowing eyes flashing through the nebula's haze. It wasn't just a machine, it was a hunter, programmed with a single purpose: to destroy anything in its path. Lyra's fingers tightened around her plasma gun, her breath shallow as the ship bucked again, throwing her against the side of her seat. Every warning light flashed red, the control panel flashing with alerts. The ship was losing power, and fast. "Mason!" she shouted over the noise, her voice tight. "We're not going to make it. The ship's almost dead." Mason didn't answer immediately. His face was tight with concentration, his eyes glued to the viewport, studying the nebula's unstable cloud patterns. He muttered something under his breath, pressing buttons frantically as he tried to keep the ship together. "I know," he finally said, voice strained. "But we don't have a choice. The swarm's right behind us, and the only way we survive this is if we outsmart them. Hold tight." He slammed the fighter into a sharp barrel roll, diving deeper into the storm. Lyra glanced back, eyes narrowing as the drone loomed just behind them, its energy weapon charging for another strike. The creature didn't need to be faster or stronger. It was programmed to predict their every move. It would catch them, and they'd be dead before they even saw the end coming. Lyra felt a chill in her bones. There was no easy escape from the swarm. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was humanity's fight against an unstoppable force, and Mason, an ordinary human, had dragged her into it. With a flick of his wrist, Mason threw the fighter into a sudden, chaotic dive, heading directly into the dense cloud of gas at the heart of the nebula. "Get ready!" he yelled. The ship groaned, engines sputtering as it barely held together under the pressure. Lyra's heart pounded as she braced herself for whatever was coming next. They plunged deeper into the storm, their surroundings becoming an eerie blur of charged gas and shifting lights. The ship's controls flashed erratically, struggling to adapt to the environment. The drone followed, unfazed by the chaos around it. It wasn't affected by the storm. Its sensors could cut through the interference like it was nothing. Mason cursed as they entered the heart of the nebula, the ship's sensors going completely haywire. The radiation and plasma surges around them made it almost impossible to track anything. This was their chance. "Lyra, I need you to trust me," Mason said, voice steady despite the danger. "We're going to break its tracking system. Just follow my lead." Lyra swallowed hard, nodding. She wasn't sure what Mason had in mind, but she didn't have a choice. The drone was closing in. With a sudden, sharp movement, Mason jerked the ship to the left, plummeting into the heart of a massive energy storm. Lightning-like discharges sparked across the ship's hull, shaking it violently. Lyra's head snapped back as the fighter spun out of control, heading directly into a dense cloud of plasma. The drone followed without hesitation, unaware of the trap they were setting. Mason didn't slow down. Instead, he flew straight into the eye of the storm, where the energy blasts were the strongest. The drone followed, exactly as he'd predicted. The ship lurched, spinning wildly as a massive surge of energy erupted from the storm, hitting the drone square in its path. There was a flash of light, a blinding, searing explosion, and for a moment, everything went silent. The energy of the nebula had overloaded the drone's sensors, causing it to malfunction and lose track of them. The drone tumbled through space, its lights flickering wildly. Mason didn't stop. He pushed the fighter deeper into the storm, using the swirling plasma to hide their signature from the remaining swarm ships. As the storm began to settle, the ship limped forward, barely holding together. Lyra stared at the drone, now drifting aimlessly, completely disabled. It was a temporary victory, nothing more. The swarm wouldn't stop. But for the first time since they'd escaped the station, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. They weren't dead yet. The battle wasn't over, but Mason had just given them a fighting chance. The real war had just begun. The tension in the cockpit was thick, the hum of the ship's struggling systems filling the silence. The nebula was still around them, though the storm had died down, leaving a swirling haze of colorful gases. They had managed to escape the drone, but it was clear that this was only the beginning. Mason's fingers danced over the controls, his face grim as he tried to get the ship to respond. The warning lights continued to blink furiously, the ship's damage more apparent by the second. Lyra Vex leaned forward, her eyes scanning the empty space beyond the viewport. The silence outside was deafening, but she knew they couldn't rest just yet. The swarm wasn't done with them. "Mason, we've got to find somewhere to regroup," Lyra said, her voice sharp with urgency. "We can't keep running. We need supplies, weapons, something." Mason glanced up at her, his eyes narrowed. "I know. But we can't risk being followed. If they find us, we're dead. This ship's not going to last much longer either. We need to find help." Lyra nodded, understanding. There was no time to waste. They needed a plan. And they needed it fast. But their options were limited. The swarm was vast, and their forces were everywhere. If they could just find another human fleet, maybe they could hold their own. But that was a big if. "Wait," Lyra said suddenly, her eyes narrowing on the display. "There's something. A signal. It's faint, but—" Mason's hands moved quickly over the controls, zooming in on the data. The signal was weak, coming from a nearby asteroid belt that was rich in mineral deposits. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a glimmer of hope in Mason's eyes. "That could be a station or a ship," he said, his voice tinged with a rare sense of optimism. "We need to go there, now." With a burst of energy that the battered ship could barely manage, Mason steered them toward the asteroid belt. As they neared, the space around them seemed even more desolate, the asteroid field dark and foreboding. It felt like they were entering the belly of a beast, an endless, silent void filled with hidden dangers. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The signal was still coming through, growing slightly stronger as they drew closer. The hope that had sparked in Mason's eyes quickly dimmed as the situation became more dire. "Keep your eyes peeled," Mason muttered, his voice tight. "We could be walking right into a trap." The asteroid field was dense, and navigating through it was anything but easy. The ship's damaged systems made it difficult to maneuver, and Lyra could feel every jolt as Mason expertly piloted the fighter through the maze of floating rocks. It felt like they were swimming through a dangerous current, trying to avoid unseen predators lurking just beyond their vision. Suddenly, a bright flash of light broke through the darkness, followed by a deep rumble that shook the ship to its core. Mason cursed under his breath as he twisted the controls, pulling the ship sharply to the side to avoid a massive asteroid that came barreling toward them. The ship's systems screamed in protest, but they managed to dodge the obstacle, barely. "What the hell was that?" Lyra gasped, her heart racing as she gripped the seat. Mason didn't answer immediately, his focus locked on the controls. The rumble echoed again, and this time, it was closer. A shadow appeared in the distance, something huge, drifting silently between the asteroids. It wasn't a natural formation. It was a ship, but not just any ship. It was massive, dark, and battered, like it had been through countless battles. A human ship, or at least it used to be. Mason's eyes widened. "That's a warship," he said softly, his voice filled with disbelief. The warship had clearly been abandoned, left to drift aimlessly through the asteroid belt. Its once pristine hull was covered in scars and dents, a testament to the battles it had fought. But it was still intact, and that meant something. "This is it," Mason said, his voice suddenly filled with renewed determination. "If we can get on board, we might have a chance." The ship wasn't entirely without life. There were signs of human presence, scraps of equipment, faint heat signatures, but no movement. The warship was eerily quiet, its lights dim and its engines cold. Mason maneuvered their ship toward a small docking bay, careful to avoid any potential traps. They had to be cautious. Lyra could feel the weight of the situation. They were entering the heart of enemy territory. Even though it was a human warship, it was no guarantee that they would find safety. The swarm had infiltrated humanity's forces before, but they had no other choice. As Mason guided the fighter into the docking bay, the sound of the ship's engines slowing to a halt felt like a countdown. They were about to board a ghost ship, and what awaited them inside was unknown. The air was thick with anticipation, but Lyra didn't allow herself to relax. They had made it this far, but it was far from over. Mason carefully piloted the fighter into the docking bay of the derelict warship, the sound of the ship's engines groaning as the landing gears engaged. Lyra Vex could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty of what awaited them pressing down on her chest. The docking bay was dimly lit, the lights flickering as if they had long lost their battle against time. The moment the ship's engines powered down, the silence enveloped them like a thick blanket. They were no longer on the run, but that didn't mean they were safe. Every second felt heavy, like a countdown to something they couldn't control. Mason unstrapped his seatbelt and turned to Lyra, his face set in a grim expression. "Stay sharp," he said, voice low. "We don't know what we're walking into." Lyra nodded, her grip tightening around her plasma gun. She had seen enough of the galaxy's horrors to know that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. They weren't just dealing with the swarm anymore. They were on a forgotten ship, a relic of a once mighty fleet that had likely been abandoned for a reason. The airlock hissed open with a deafening sound, revealing the dark, empty corridors of the warship. They stepped out into the eerie quiet, the cold metal beneath their feet echoing as they made their way down the hallway. Lyra's senses were on high alert, every flicker of movement or sudden noise making her flinch. They moved cautiously, their footsteps slow and deliberate as they navigated the darkened halls. The walls were covered in dust and grime, but there were signs of recent activity. Scratches on the floor, a flickering light here and there. It was as though someone had been here recently, but no one had stayed. Mason led the way, his hand resting on the blaster at his side, ready for anything. Lyra followed closely behind, her breath shallow as they passed empty rooms and long-forgotten control panels. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Though the ship was deserted, the place had a strange, abandoned feeling to it, like the memories of its former crew still lingered in the walls, hidden in the shadows. They reached the ship's command center after what felt like an eternity. The large, open space was eerily quiet, with a broken console in the center, its lights flickering weakly. It looked like it had been ransacked, with pieces of equipment scattered across the floor. But amidst the chaos, there was something that caught Lyra's eye. A monitor, still operational, displayed a live feed from the exterior of the ship. The screen was hazy, but the image was unmistakable. Two massive ships, the swarm's warships, were approaching, their silhouettes just visible through the haze of space. Lyra's heart sank. The swarm had found them. The fight wasn't over. Mason cursed under his breath. his eyes scanning the display. "They're closing in fast," he muttered. "We don't have much time." The desperation in his voice made Lyra's stomach twist. They had thought they'd found a temporary refuge, but now it was clear that this abandoned warship wasn't the sanctuary they had hoped for. It was a trap, a forgotten relic, a decoy for the swarm to pick off anything that came near. Lyra's mind raced as Mason began to access the ship's systems, trying to get any kind of response from the dormant consoles. The air around them felt thick with the impending danger, each second making it harder to breathe. There was no time to waste. If they didn't act fast, they would be caught in the crossfire, and they wouldn't survive the swarm's onslaught. With a deep breath, Lyra turned to Mason. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Mason didn't answer right away, his eyes glued to the flickering display. Finally, he stood up, his face resolute. "We're not dying here," he said, his voice unwavering. "We'll fight." He worked quickly, accessing the ship's old weapon systems, desperately trying to activate them. Lyra joined him, helping where she could, though the systems were ancient and barely functional. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as they struggled to bring the ship's weapons back online. Every flicker of a console light felt like a victory, but it wasn't enough. The swarm was already almost within range, and the ship's defenses were barely holding together. Finally, just as the first swarm ship loomed into view, Mason's hand slammed down on a control panel. The ship's weapon systems hummed to life, a deep, resonating growl that sent a thrill of hope through Lyra's chest. They weren't out of options yet. The warship might be old, damaged, and on the brink of falling apart, but it still had a few tricks left to play. Mason turned to her, his eyes fierce. "Get to the gunnery station. I'll pilot this thing. We're going to give them hell." Lyra didn't hesitate. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no more running. It was time to fight back. The swarm had no idea what they were about to unleash. Humanity might have been outnumbered, outgunned, and pushed to the edge, but they would never be beaten. Mason and Lyra moved quickly, each step filled with purpose as the countdown to battle grew ever closer. The massive swarm ships were now in clear view, their dark silhouettes filling the screen as they drew nearer. Mason was at the helm, his hands flying over the controls of the old warship, desperately trying to get it into a fighting position. Lyra, meanwhile, rushed to the gunnery station, her heart hammering in her chest as the ship's ancient weapon systems hummed to life. It was a race against time, and every second felt like an eternity. The swarm ships were closing in fast, their weapon systems already powered up, ready to unleash hell. Lyra could feel the heat of the impending battle in her bones. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. The moment where humanity's resilience would be put to the ultimate test. The warship groaned under the stress of its aging systems, but it wasn't giving up yet. Lyra gripped the gunner controls tightly, her eyes focused on the approaching enemy. She could see the outlines of the swarm ships, their sleek, terrifying shapes cutting through the darkness of space. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but Lyra wasn't afraid. She had seen humanity face worse odds before and come out victorious. This was just another challenge to overcome. Mason's voice came over the comms, calm and steady despite the chaos. "Lyra, we've got one shot at this. When I give the word, you hit them with everything we've got." She nodded, even though she knew he couldn't see her. She was ready. The swarm ships were now within striking distance, and the battle began. Mason opened fire first, sending a barrage of plasma blasts toward the lead swarm ship. The old warship shook with each shot, but the weapons were still strong. The first blast struck the enemy ship dead center, causing a violent explosion that lit up the void of space. But the swarm wasn't backing down. They returned fire immediately, their weapons slicing through space with deadly accuracy. Lyra braced herself, her hands steady on the controls, her eyes never leaving the screen. The explosions rattled the ship, but she held firm, waiting for the perfect moment. Mason's voice crackled through the comms again. "Lyra, now!" She didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she activated the gunnery systems, unleashing everything they had left. The warship's cannons roared to life, sending a massive wave of fire toward the enemy ships. The blast hit one of the swarm's vessels directly, causing it to veer off course, its shields failing under the intensity of the attack. The swarm ship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, leaving nothing but debris floating in space. Lyra's heart raced. They had taken one down, but there were still more coming. The battle intensified. The swarm ships retaliated with greater fury, their weapons hammering into the warship's shields. The ship rocked violently, but the shields held for now. Mason was guiding them through the chaos, weaving the ship in and out of the incoming fire with expert precision. Lyra was focused, her hands a blur on the controls as she kept firing. But just as they thought they were gaining the upper hand, a new threat appeared. A massive, heavily armed swarm flagship emerged from the darkness, its weapons already charging. The odds had just become even worse. "Brace yourself," Mason shouted over the comms, his voice full of urgency. The flagship opened fire, its blasts striking the warship with terrifying force. The shields flickered and weakened, and for a moment it seemed like they might fail. Lyra's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to give up. They had come too far to let it all fall apart now. With a surge of determination, she fired everything she had at the flagship. The shots hit hard, but the flagship's armor was too strong. They needed something more, something bigger. Mason's voice came through again, calm, but with an edge of desperation. "Lyra, I'm going to pull us into close range. Get ready to fire everything." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she nodded, her grip tightening on the controls. This was it. They had to end it now. Mason piloted the warship into a sharp dive, bringing them closer to the flagship. The closer they got, the more intense the fire became, but Mason was skilled. He was weaving through the shots with a deadly grace. "Now, Lyra!" Mason shouted. With one last, desperate effort, Lyra unleashed everything she had. The warship's full firepower erupted in a massive wave of destruction. The flagship took the full brunt of the blast. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening explosion, the flagship's hull cracked open, sending debris scattering through space. The swarm flagship was gone. Lyra's hands were still shaking as she looked at the screen. They had done it. They had won. The remaining swarm ships, now leaderless and crippled, began to retreat, their formations breaking apart in chaos. The warship had taken a beating, but it had held together. Humanity had triumphed once again. Mason let out a long breath, his voice finally softening. "We did it," he said, almost in disbelief. "We actually did it." But even in the aftermath of the battle, Lyra knew this wasn't the end. They had won this fight, but the war was far from over. Yet, for now, they had proven something. Humanity's will to survive, to fight back, was unbreakable. Against all odds, they had stood their ground and emerged victorious. And that, Lyra thought, was just the beginning.